Okay, good morning, everybody. So today's class is about the psychology of inadequacy. I assume the sound was okay, yes? Okay. Right, so what does this mean exactly? So I want to focus this morning on a verse. It's a verse in Psalms, Psalms 35:10, which I didn't copy onto the board, which I should have, but I didn't. So Psalms 35:10, and the verse says like this. It's a part of a verse. The Hebrew is Matzil ani michazak mimenu, which translated means he rescues a poor person from those who are stronger than him. Those are stronger than the poor person. He rescues, talking about God rescues a poor person from those who are stronger. And when we say poor, it probably means in this context an unfortunate person. Not necessarily poor monetarily, financially, but rescues an unfortunate person from those who are more powerful than him. In other words, it's basically in a certain sense, it's a social justice issue that's been spoken about over here. In other words, the idea that King David, who's the author of Psalms, is talking about someone who's downtrodden, someone who is being oppressed. Eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, he will be rescued. However, there are various interpretations of this, and that's what I really want to get to soon. But I'd like to introduce it kind of with a story. It's a story about a fellow who was living in a village in Eastern Europe, and very, very downtrodden, poverty-stricken, very and unfortunate, let's put it that way. And he kept on thinking of what it is that he can do to change his situation, and he couldn't come up with anything. Eventually, he decided that the only chance that he has is if he goes to the big city. And so he made his plans. He told his family he's going to go to the big city, and there hopefully he'll be able to find some work and be able to pay off his debts, and they'll live a better life. The family was very nervous about this, very adamant that the big city is not a place for a country bumpkin like you, and it's dangerous, and all kinds of ruffians over there, and it's not a good idea. But he convinced them that this was the only alternative, and he didn't have any other thing to do, and he's going off to the city, the big city. So that's in fact what he did. Made his way to the city, and of course, he had to hitch rides along the way, and he was walking part of the way, and so on and so forth. He comes into the city. It's in the story, the city of Vilna. He comes in, which is in Lithuania. He comes into the city late at night. And, he doesn't really have a place to stay. He'd scraped together some money that he could borrow for whatever he could borrow for, accommodations and food and things like that. But he had very, very little. In any event, he sees the light on and there's an inn. And he decides he's going to go to the inn and do his best to find a room, a place. He goes to the inn, and the innkeeper happens to be another Jewish innkeeper, and the owner was Jewish. And he saw this poor fellow, and he said to him, "Look, I don't actually have any spare rooms. All of the rooms are full. But what I could suggest to you is there's one room, which is a very large room and has 2 beds in it, which is currently occupied by a Russian general. However, this Russian general is drunk. He comes in every night. He stays in this hotel for several weeks at a time usually, and he comes in every night, and he's completely drunk, plastered. And he went to sleep, and if you're very, very quiet and you leave early in the morning before he wakes up, you can go sleep in the other bed and he'll never know the difference." So the fellow decided, he's going to do that part. He doesn't have any other chance, and so he did. He got into the bed, And he made sure to ask the innkeeper to be sure to wake him up on time, before the Russian general would wake up. And the innkeeper agreed. He would rise early in the morning anyway, so he was going to wake him up. So comes the morning, there's a soft knock at the door, and the fellow wakes up. The Russian general is still snoring away, and it's still dark outside. He can't see anything, but he gets dressed in the clothes where he left them. And he creeps out of the hotel from the back door. He had already paid his money for the night. And he creeps out of the hotel, the back door, and he disappears. Well, he's walking into the city now, and wherever he walks into the city, people are greeting him, and they're nodding to him, and they're waving at him, and they're saluting him, and he can't figure out what's going on. He says, this is a town of ruffians, a city of ruffians. The people here are very nice, very respectful, very, they don't even know me, and they're waving to me, and they're saluting me, and so on and so forth. They're a good bunch of people. So he's going on, and as he goes into the city, this occurs more and more, and people are, they're very, very respectful towards him, and so on. Till eventually he comes to a store, and outside the store it's a clothing store, and they have clothing hanging outside, and he sees there's a mirror, and as he passes the mirror, he sees someone is standing in his position who's dressed in a Russian general's uniform. So suddenly he realizes what happened. He said, oh no, oy vey, they woke up the wrong guy. Okay, so the story is meant to illustrate the idea that very often we have things that we're, so to speak, dressed in. We have powers, we have abilities, we have gifts that we've been given, and we somehow think they don't belong to us. Or at least we have them, but we don't use them. And to a very large extent, this is illustrative of the way that we can re-explain this verse. We started explaining the verse that we're talking here about a person who is an unfortunate. And we said like this, Matzil ani mechazak mimenu. He saves, God saves, or rescues a poor or a downtrodden person from those who are stronger than him. The Maggid of Mezritch, now, the Maggid of Mezritch was a very great man, a student, the primary student of the Baal Shem Tov. And it was really from the time that he was, he took over the leadership, the nascent movement of Hasidism began to expand tremendously. Even though the Baal Shem Tov was the founder, the Maggid of Mezritch really, in many, many ways, expanded it way beyond what it was before. A very great person. In any event, the Maggid of Mezritch, Maggid means a teacher. The teacher of Mezritch was the city that he was from, or the town. So the Maggid explained this verse in two different ways, which can illustrate to us some very fundamental ideas in how we should really look at things. The first explanation that he gives, besides a simple explanation, and whenever there's an explanation of a verse, all explanations are valid. One explanation doesn't push out another or cancel or negate any other explanation. These are all valid explanations, all valid ideas. The Maggid explains as follows. When it says, Matzil ani mechazak mimeno, he rescues or he saves a person who is stronger than him. So he emphasizes the idea of stronger than him. What does than him mean? If you read it in Hebrew, it makes a lot of sense. You could say that the stronger than comes from him. It's the way he looks at himself that he believes that someone else is more powerful than he is. He rescues a person from someone who is stronger than him in his own estimation, in other words. He's the one that's thinking that way, and it's his thinking that causes him to feel that he is an unfortunate, that causes him to feel that someone is more powerful than him, and causes him to feel that he's inadequate. He's not up to the task. He's not up to the task of being able to see through whatever it is that that has to be done right now. He's not able to pull himself out of the situation that he's in because he's inadequate. He doesn't have what it is that he needs. He's missing something. But it's all a mindset. It's not reality. It really comes from, yes, certainly there are circumstances in which a person could find himself in an unfortunate state. And it happens to all of us. It happens to everybody. The question is, what do you do with it? Does the state defeat you? Or is the state a starting point for something more? To illustrate the idea, the word ani in Hebrew, if you transliterate it to English, the word ani would be spelled A-N-I. And that word also means, there's a synonym for that word, and the synonym is the word dull. Yeah, dull. Dull meaning also poverty-stricken. There's actually degrees of poverty. Ani is someone who's lacking, and dull is someone who has nothing. The sages say, "Delet le migarma klum." He doesn't migarme klum. He doesn't have anything of his own. But the word dull, or in the if we speak about it as a state of being, it's called dalut. Yeah, dalut, poverty. So the word dalut, poverty, can also be explained as the word, in Hebrew you can do this because dalut is written dalad lamed taf, dalut, sometimes vav taf, but dalad lamed taf. It also can be read as delet. What's a delet? A delet is a door. It's an opening. It's a possibility. It's a possibility for the future. If a person looks upon a negative situation, an adverse situation, as an opening, as a door through which he can walk and go into a new situation, that is already a tremendous advantage psychologically as to where he is going and where he can move towards. Now, let me give you an example, again, a story about a person who really went through tremendous suffering, but he came through it with such a sense of humor that we understand why he survived. It's a story about in the previous generation, or perhaps the generation before that, during the time of the Gulag in Stalin's Gulag, where he would send people out to exile in Siberia or other places, and he hoped that they would. These were enemies of the state, enemies of communism, enemies of or supposed enemies of Stalin, and some of the most fiercest enemies, so to speak, people he regarded as enemies, were people who were religious in any way, but particularly religious Jews. And they were sent by the thousand to prisons and to the Gulag in Siberia and various other places. Terrible situation. In fact, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was also sent to Kostroma, which was also a terrible prison, and so on and so forth. And many people suffered. So this particular Orthodox religious Hasidic Jew was sent to Siberia, and he spent in Siberia 20 years. That was usually the longest sentence, was usually 20 years. He spent 20 years in Siberia, and somehow he survived. And when he came back, they asked him, what did you learn over there? What did you learn? Of course, there were many things that you learned, but he said, the one thing that he said, the one thing that I learned was that the Yetzer Hara, the inclination that we have to do evil, a person has two inclinations, the inclination towards good and the inclination towards evil. We'll call the Yetzer HaTov, the inclination to good, and the Yetzer Hara, the inclination towards evil. We all have these, and the objective, obviously, is to make the inclination towards good overcome and eventually banish the inclination towards evil, towards self-destruction, towards destruction of others, towards negativity, and so on. So it says, what I learned was as follows. The inclination towards self-destruction or evil which is called the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, as we said before, is called in Mishlei. Mishlei is Proverbs. It's called Melech Zoken Uksil, an old and foolish king. Why is it called a king? Because it rules over us in most cases. Why is it called a Zoken, an old king? Because it comes into a person before the positive inclination comes in. The inclination towards good only comes in when a person starts to mature. Traditionally, in Jewish tradition, from the age of Bar Mitzvah, the age of 13 onwards, when a person becomes obligated to fulfill the commandments. So therefore it's called Zaken, it's old. He said, I never understood why. However, then I understand why it's called a king, it rules over us. Why it's called old, because it's older than our good inclination. But why is it called a fool? It's not such a fool. After all, it manages to outsmart us, right? Most of the time. This inclination towards negativity, towards evil, towards self-destruction wins a lot of the time. It manages to fool us into all kinds of negative activities and thinking. So why is it called a fool? An old and foolish king. Why is it called a fool? It's not fool at all. Said, I never understood this, and then I went to Siberia. And I spent 20 years in Siberia, and then I understood. Now I understand why it's called a fool. Because in 20 years in Siberia, it remained with me. It could have stayed at home in a nice warm bed and enjoyed itself with all the food that it wanted and had an easy life, and yet it chose to come along with me. What a fool. So you see, here was a person in terrible, terrible circumstances, and he made a joke out of it. It wasn't, it wasn't so bad. He said, I haven't changed so fundamentally that, now I can call myself a wise person, a person who's overcome, a person who becomes a tzaddik, a person who overcomes he's a righteous, saintly person. I'm not that. I still have the same issues, but I can look at them with a little bit of amusement. In any event, to take it a little bit further, the explanation that we just said, that the negativity, the state of poverty is a state of mind. Our sages say that ain oni ela b'da'at. The only person who's really poor, who's really unfortunate, is when he's lacking in da'at. He's lacking in the ability, da'at meaning the ability to weigh things up and put them in the proper perspective. He doesn't have da'at. He doesn't have the ability to put things in the proper perspective and to be able to see that his circumstances are not nearly as bad as he or she thinks they are. That's the second explanation from the Maggid of Mezritch. Now there's a third explanation. The third explanation is as follows. So the same words, the same verse. Matzil oni mechazak mimeno. He saves a poor person, someone who's lacking das, who's lacking this proper perspective, mechazak, from the strength that comes from him himself. Right? How does a person overcome issues, overcome adversity? From the strength he finds within himself. Mechazak, the strength, mimeno, that comes from him himself. Here the interpretation is not that this negative situation is a result of your mindset, but that your solution to the negative situation comes from within you. You have the ability. Anyone is faced with a situation as part of actually fundamental belief in Jewish thought. It's a fundamental belief that a person is never put in a situation that he can't handle and that he cannot pull himself out of. There's a famous story of Joseph, when Joseph was put in the pit. Joseph was put in the pit by his brothers, and then he was sold into slavery. and he became a servant of one of the Egyptian ministers. And then he was accused by the minister's name is Potiphar. He was accused by Potiphar's wife of him trying to seduce her. In fact, it was the other way around. And when he refused, she got angry and she made up this whole story that he tried to seduce her rather than she trying to seduce him. In any event, he gets put in prison. And he's in prison, and then he doesn't seem to find any way out. And he asks, it's the birthday of Pharaoh, and they know that on the birthday of Pharaoh, he shows clemency towards some prisoners. So he asked one of the prisoners whom they already knew was going to get clemency. He asked one of the prisoners to mention his name to Pharaoh for clemency. And then when the other prisoner got out, he had been before also an important servant of Pharaoh. When he got out, it says, and he forgot. He forgot him, and it uses a double expression. Lo zachar Yosef v'yishkachehu. He didn't remember Joseph, and he forgot him. So the commentators explain why it is that he forgot. He didn't remember is one thing, but he forgot because Joseph afterwards prayed and said, oh, what have I done? I'm relying on another human being to get me out of the situation. I have the ability to get myself out of the situation. I hope that he forgets, and he prayed that he would forget that situation. Why? Because a person in Joseph's position, that doesn't refer to all of us, but someone like Joseph, who was a very, very lofty soul, he should not have to rely on the services of anybody else to get him out of his situation. To a certain extent, that's true of all of us, which doesn't mean to say, again, that we shouldn't use outside help when we can get it. The problem is not using outside help, but becoming reliant on somebody else solving our issues. One of the principal fundamental ideas, again, in Jewish thought is that you've been given everything that you need to overcome your own issues. The chazak, the strength to be able to do so, comes from within you. And it's not just the strength simply of being able to duck and survive, duck your head and until the situation passes and improves. We're not saying like that. We're saying that the situation that you find yourself in is an opening. It's a door. It's a door to be able to change things into the positive, to be able to change things into a much greater opportunity than one ever had before. So this is the teaching then of the Maggid of Mezritch. There's three ways of looking at the same verse. On the one hand, a person who is really in a situation where, for whatever reason, he cannot help himself, so he has on whom to rely. He can rely on God. God will help him out of his situation. But first, he has to look at the situation and see, is that situation just a lack of my own inability to discern the good therein and the opportunity that lies therein? And am I sort of manufacturing an adversity where something doesn't exist? In other words, it's coming from me. It's coming from the way I'm thinking about things. Once he's done that, then he should examine, where are my strengths? What strengths do I have? What powers of soul do I have to be able to get me out of this situation that I'm in by dredging up strengths that I didn't even know I had. There was an article that I read once, many years ago already, but it was an article in a newspaper about a family that lived on a farm very far away from, it was a big farm, and it was kind of far away from civilization, really. And there was primarily the people living on the farm was a family of a couple generations. So it so happened that the son of this woman, who was an elderly woman, she was in her 70s, and her son was one of the farm people, but he had to fix one of the machines. He actually had to fix a car because they had to go into town or whatever it was, and he needed to fix the car. There was something wrong with the car. And everyone else was way out in the fields, and but it was before the time of cell phones, so there was no way to contact them easily. She didn't even know where they were. Anyway, he was under the car, and somehow or another, the jack, which was holding up the car, collapsed, and the car fell down on top of him. He's sitting under the car, and he's lying under the car, and he's getting crushed. He screams out to his mother to do something. Now, there's a little old lady in her 70s, and she rushes outside, sees what's happening, knows that there's no possibility of getting help anywhere. There's no one around. So she grabs the car and she lifts, and we're talking about a lady in her 70s, a little old lady in her 70s, and she lifts up the car as much as she can. And she obviously didn't lift it up like Superman or whatever, but she lifted it up sufficiently for him to manage somehow or another to crawl out. Now, the cars in those days were not so lightweight as they are sometimes today. It was a heavy car, and it was crushing him. Somehow or another, she found the strength to be able to lift it up. As you probably know, I'm sure everyone's experienced circumstances like this. The ability to do things in an emergency calls up powers that we're not even aware that we have. A person goes way beyond himself in a situation of total adversity, so that a person could do things that just would be impossible in normal circumstances. We would deem them to be impossible. But that's part of the message here that the Maggid of Mezritch is saying. You have powers that you don't even know that you have. And if you learn how to use them, then you can overcome any situation of adversity whatsoever. So the psychology of inadequacy is, first of all, don't think you're inadequate. You think you're inadequate is what's causing the negative situation. You're thinking that you're inadequate. And if it so happens that you do find yourself in a situation which perhaps is even of your own making, but nevertheless, it's the opportunity to dredge up abilities and powers that you weren't even aware that you had, and face the situation fairly and squarely and overcome. That is called in the writings of one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch, who was the fourth Rebbe, the fourth Grand Rebbe, Grand Rabbi of Lubavitch. Lubavitch is a Hasidic movement. He had an expression that he used to say, Lechatchila, ariber. I say from the outset, go over the top. Meaning to say, when a person has a barrier, he reaches barriers or adversity or whatever it is, usually the way to do it, people usually do is they duck until the time passes. They'll keep a low profile, duck their heads, and just hope things will change and things will pass and things will get better. That's one approach. And in certain circumstances, perhaps it's valid. Another way is to try and skirt the problem. In other words, you come across a barrier, there's a wall that you can't get over, go around the side. Right? Go around until you find an opening. Somewhere. He said, my attitude towards these things is Lechatchila, ariber. Don't worry about going under. Don't look for ways around it to try and avoid the issue. Lechatchila, ariber, from the beginning, go over the top. In other words, don't regard it as a barrier. Regard it as a way of raising yourself up to a higher status, and then you catapult yourself. Using the negative situation, catapult yourself into something that essentially even gives you the ability to transcend yourself. So that's the teaching for today. Now, a couple of questions I see over here. Let me see here to go back. Okay.